Hiya! We're back with more buffs, and I'm still out of the country. Another day I get to use the setup. Don't look at the time. The time is completely normal. Time for a refreshing beverage. Much better. Alright, let's do it. So Fatebound got huge buffs. The heads buff got additional stacks, so this is now double. It's now 10 baseline, so 10% on the first flip, 2% for each stack. So that's good. The tails damage also got a major buff. Lucky coin, this is the added coin damage from the capstone that also got buffed. Delivered Doom got buffed as well. I don't have an override for this because it's a little weird. But we'll talk about the numbers in a little bit. They're not exactly complete. I am trying to sleep tonight, so... anyways. Fate Intertwined also got a buff. Now, Fate Intertwined duplicates Envenom critical strike damage. It duplicates, I think... Don't quote me on this, but I think it duplicates the entire Envenom. And not just the crit damage part. It's worded a little weird. You'd think that it's only the bonus damage, but it is the entire Envenom. The problem is that it's only 30% of the Envenom, and it's already, like, a chance to crit, right? So it's 30% of, like, 30%. So this isn't, like, Fate Intertwined still kind of sucks. But what can you do? Moving on. All ability damage increased by 10%. This is on top of the 15% that we already got like a couple weeks ago. So this is another 10%, as well as an auto attack damage buff. So that together is just all damage, right? Then we have Crimson Tempest and Venomous Wounds. So Crimson Tempest, this is on top of the 10% we got last week. I think it was last week. And then Venomous Wounds going from 8 was 7. So that's a little bit more energy. It's not as big as it might seem. I have run all the numbers on this, except for some of the weirdness here. I don't have Delivered Doom and Fate Intertwined. But it's close enough. It doesn't really change the numbers that much, you'll see. So let's go over some stuff. So this is post-buff. You'll see that Fatebound and Deathstalker are quite close together now in single target. If you're looking for AoE numbers, all of this is a complete mess, and we don't have a lot of interactions currently working. Deathstalker marks, for example, still cringe to play in Mythic Plus. The boss in Mists, the maze in Mists, the third boss in Necrotic Wake. Basically, anytime the boss goes immune and drops debuffs, you can lose the mark. Echoing Reprimand still doesn't work with the mark, so there's a lot of stuff that's still outstanding that we don't really quite know how it should work. Dashing Scoundrel's broken again, so that's cool. There's just a lot of things that make the AoE and Mythic Plus numbers way too volatile. So I'm not going to be showing those, but you can rest assured that the buffs are fairly similar, right? It's just flat damage. They're all damage, all abilities, Crimson Tempest, the Fatebound coin getting buffed, right? That's just flat damage. So you don't have to worry too much about that. The numbers that I'm showing in single target here kind of also translate over into AoE, and I keep unplugging and replugging my headphones. That's fun. But yeah, so the numbers sort of translate, not one-to-one, but it's kind of close. You can get a similar idea, right? But I'm only going to be showing single target because that's the thing that's kind of trustworthy right now. And we'll see what else happens and what bugs get fixed and where we go from there. So, this was the before. So Fatebound very clearly behind, noticeably 6%. And you'll see that it's right over 900,000. And now we're looking at about 1.5 for both of them. So it is a pretty substantial buff. It's about 16% for Fatebound, almost 17%, and it is roughly 10 or 11% for Deathstalker overall, with everything factored in. Now, Venomous Wounds, out of that, I will pull this up so you can see. Venomous Wounds here, if we look at just Deathstalker, we're looking at 51 actions per minute. And on the baseline, this is before all of the buffs, we are looking at 48.9. So we gained 2 actions per minute. It's technically more actions, right? Like, yes, it is more actions. You're not really going to notice this. Just is what it is. In AoE, you definitely won't notice the Venomous Wounds buff because you're already capped on energy in AoE from like spreading all your bleeds, so that also kind of doesn't really... You should maybe notice it a little bit in single target, but it's... I don't really trust it too much. But it is a slight damage up. It's 2% and 2 actions per minute, so whoop-de-doo, I guess. Fantastic stuff. The next thing, this is specifically the Fatebound buffs. So you can kind of get a little bit of a comparison here. Fatebound buffs alone, plus or minus some stuff. So just the coin stuff, catching up quite a bit. So this is simply the heads buff, the tails buff, and the capstone buff. So this is without the Venomous Wounds buff, which will give Fatebound some more value, and this is without the aura buff. So just the Fatebound stuff alone is 4%, but then it compounds, and that's how we get to this number, right? This is with everything attached. Now, Fatebound is actually a bit closer than this, again, because of the Delivered Doom and Fate Intertwined stuff. These are fairly minor, but you can see that it's basically equal. It's very close. And so moving on, I have a couple of other comparisons here. So this is Fatebound with the coin turned off. This is no heads, no tails. We're doing about 893,000. And so this is a little bit important for the balance. But I'll talk about that at the end. So here's the coin, just heads, right? So this is all the tails damage turned off and just the heads buff. So you see that we're going from about 50,000, right? 50,000 DPS from that. Now, the last one's the tails buff, and you'll see that's 100,000. Almost on the dot, right? So the tails buff is currently twice as, or the tails damage itself is twice as strong as the heads buff, which kind of makes sense because if you take a look at the sim, you'll see, oh, that's not the right one, Fatebound. You'll see that the Fatebound coin here, just the tails part, is doing 10% of our damage. And if you look at the uptime on... I scrolled too far. Uptime on heads. Heads is a 51% uptime, and while there are stacks here, right? Like it could stack a couple times, it could chain itself up. 50% uptime on a buff that's probably around 12 or 14% makes a big difference, right? So the math checks out both ways. And heads realistically needs to be a little bit stronger if it is supposed to compete, right? If they're supposed to be equal. If they're not equal, we run into some interesting situations. And for that, I'm going to actually pull up a talents calculator. Interesting problem number 1. If tails is strong, right? We have stuff like inevitability here. Cold Blood benefits the next 2 abilities. It's only in Venom. The coins flipped are guaranteed to match the face is the same flip. Let me zoom in a bit. So if they match the same face as the last flip, there is a world where you want this to land on the tails buff because the tails buff is much stronger than the heads buff, right? If tails is twice as strong, that means you're getting twice the value from flipping the same one. Now, obviously, there's some scaling issues that go into this, right? The heads buff itself starts at 10 and then goes up by 2, so that's 20% of an increase, whereas the tails buff is only 10%, right? You can see it here. The Tails increases its damage by 10%. So while Tails starts off stronger, it also scales less. Whereas the Heads buff starts weak and then scales harder. So there's a lot of interesting implications to how this could affect things. Right now, no idea. I'm just speculating. Like, I'm just throwing it out there. And that's kind of the best we can do. I wish that I had something more tangible and I could be like, hey, this is what we're doing. But at the rate that they're tuning and fixing bugs, and we're finding new bugs, it's really, really hard to come up with a concrete solution. So I'm just going to keep yapping because I got more stuff that I want to talk about. Problem number 2, which isn't going to get fixed this beta, I can guarantee it. But if you look at Envenom uptime, it is quite high. And this quite high, it's not exactly 100%, but it is damn close. It is incredibly close. And this is warping the spec again, the same way that it did in Season 1. So you have stuff like taking Sanguine Blades, which you want to be above 50% so that this does damage, but then the best way to play around this is to be under 50%, which sounds like it doesn't make any sense, but I guarantee you it does, because if you stay under 50%, you can get more Envenom uptime, which is the more important of the two. And because you can't maintain, or you can maintain close to 100% on Envenom itself, what you end up getting is you run into a situation where just by trying to maintain Envenom for the buff, you naturally end up going above 50%. Just automatically sometimes. And you can actually see that a lot of the value here from Sanguine Blades is contained within Deathmark itself. Right? Deathmark itself, Sanguine Blades here and here is about 1%. Whereas on Rupture, Sanguine Blades here is 1%, and then on Garrote, Sanguine Blades here is also 1%. So a third of the value of Sanguine Blades is purely in those tiny Deathmark windows, which means we're very rarely above 50%, considering how low the uptime is on Deathmark. So that's interesting and also a little bit concerning. The energy gameplay in general seems a little bit out of balance. But again, this is a problem that the spec has had for a while. For some reason, we can't get Envenom uptime in a good spot. So we run into these situations. So that kind of blows. Now, the next thing you'll see is, even though this is a single target, that's a lot of Envenom damage. This is a ton of Envenom damage. Now, in Mythic Plus, I've tested Deathstalker quite a bit, and the problem that always ends up occurring is having to juggle the mark makes for really interesting times. So, Mists of Tir-Nasaith is a dungeon that's coming back for Season 1, and the issue with that is the first boss, you have to hit the tree guy. The tree guy goes and becomes friendly, and then you have a big damage amp where you hit the main boss, right? So you're damaging down the tree goes friendly, you hit the main boss, rinse, repeat. The issue with that is if you have the mark on the tree and the tree goes friendly, it removes all debuffs and you don't get the capstone. The same thing happens, third boss of Necrotic Wake. He jumps up on the platform. That's the guy you need to hook off of his platform with the guys, with the stitches. When he jumps up, he also removes debuffs. So that creates another problem of you can't maintain the buff on that guy either. And so it's really awkward in these situations. It happens in Raid 2, the second to last boss, Silken Court. For the intermissions, one of the bosses jumps away. There's, I think, 2 intermissions. The first one, boss A jumps away. The second one, boss B jumps away. But you have to split your raid up so that they're only hitting one of the bosses. And so if you're on the wrong boss and you have a mark, and the boss goes away during the intermission, the mark also disappears. So juggling the mark is still very difficult. And if you're not purposely sitting on the capstone for these situations and waiting and not using the capstone, you're a little out of luck. And the problem with sitting on the capstone is you don't have a markup, right? So you have things like Hunt Them Down, which is doing a significant part of her damage. But Hunt Them Down can't do damage because you don't have the markup. The mark also buffs Mutilate. That's not a thing either because you don't have the markup. You can't work down the mark without having it up. So all of this extra Mutilate damage you're getting also doesn't work. Deathstalker's mark itself is 2.8%. You're also losing this, right? Because you're just sitting there with the capstone, unable to get the markup, which is just so weird, having to sit on the capstone waiting for stuff to happen. Additionally, these are also all timed buffs, which is another problem. Like the last boss in Necrotic Wake, you have to go down. It sends you down against your will, right? You don't have a control over who goes down, and you have to go kill an ad and then come back up. If you're too slow on that, the debuff just goes away. Like, you just straight up lose the debuff. So I don't know. I don't think we're getting tangible changes to that, but it sucks, right? It is what it is, though. Some other things to note is that even though we see Fatebound and we're like, oh my god, the coin, it's 10%, it's now about as RNG as it was during Season 3. All of these buffs have gotten Fatebound back up in RNG levels, which is a little bit sucky, but it is what it is. It is a coin flip. Back when the coins were much weaker, the damage range here, this is 95% of pulls. So this is 2 standard deviations for the math nerds out there. So we're looking at a 15% DPS range across 2 standard deviations, or 95% of the pulls. With the coin being weaker, this was equal to Deathstalker. Deathstalker is 10%, which is very low. And now the coin is really strong again, which means that having large chains of it is really good, which means that the RNG goes up. That's just a natural process of buffing the coin over and over and over again. I think within the last month, the coin has gone from being like 3% to being 10%. And the lucky coin, which is the capstone, still blows, but we didn't have it at all, right? So it went from nothing to 0.7. So overall, the coin flip value has increased dramatically. Yeah. The last thing I want to cover is some cooking that has been occurring. For that, I'm going to load not that. I want to load a live page. Now, this doesn't really matter for the hero talent, right? This is agnostic to the hero talents, but it works best with Deathstalker. So right now, the idea is with Deathstalker, you can, under certain circumstances, drop Sanguine Blades and Improved Growth. And I'll show you how that works. You take Vicious Venoms, you drop these two, and then you take this. And now this looks horrid. Well, you don't do this exactly. You do this. My bad. You do this. Or if dashing doesn't work, you still go arterial. But something like this is very cooked. And the reason why this works is Sanguine Blades and Improved Growth aren't actually as strong as you might think. We just talked about how you want to be under 50%, and then Sanguine Blades naturally does a bit of damage. So you're already avoiding it, kind of. And Improved Growth just kind of is the last domino to fall. If you're not talenting Sanguine Blades, you're not going to talent Improved Growth, and you're especially not going to talent Shrouded Suffocation. You're just going to, like, these three have to be used together, basically. You can get away not using Shrouded, but Sanguine Blades and Improved Garrote together are basically coupled. If you remove Sanguine Blades, Improved Garrote falls. Which then paves the way for Vicious Venoms. Now, the thing about Vicious Venoms right now is it doesn't work with a lot of stuff. So it only works with Shiv. It doesn't work with Mastery, for example. So we're sort of thinking that that's a bug. A lot of things work with Mastery and Zoldyck, right? Zoldyck poisons and bleeds. This works with Envenom. This works with all our bleeds. This works with Kingsbane. Vicious Venoms is not a part of Zoldyck. It isn't a part of Mastery. It only works with the improved Shiv talent up here. So if they do make it work with Zoldyck, if they do make it work with Mastery, this is now an even stronger talent. And you would be taking stuff like Shiv no longer costing energy. This saves you about 300 energy over a 5-minute fight. Dashing Scoundrel also gives you about 300 energy over a 5-minute fight. So you'd be saving a lot of energy here. The spec would speed up a pretty decent amount. I think based on some math I was doing like an hour ago, it would have been like 54 actions per minute. And yeah, you're just getting a lot of energy back, which is in turn feeding more Mutilates, which is in turn doing a lot of damage. With Vicious Venom, Mutilate is going to be doing roughly 10 to 12% of your damage. It is quite significant. So, especially if they get it fixed with Mastery and Zoldyck, this is something that's actually pretty reasonable for pure single target. But we'll just have to see. Right now, this is kind of just a pipe dream a little bit. But it would be interesting to see how this works out, because if you don't take Improved Garrote, you have no reason to Vanish. So you can hold the Vanish in order to reapply the Deathstalker mark, for example, which could be cool. I have started looking at Mythic Plus stuff. I don't have anything to share in that regard, but I can tell you that Without a Trace blows super hard. It's just as bad as I've been complaining about for a long time. No response from server, incredible. But Subterfuge does nothing. Without a Trace also kind of does nothing. The argument that I've been seeing for Without a Trace is that you can hold on to Vanish for certain pulls. And the problem that I have with that argument is that like 99% of players are pugging. And if you're pugging, you have no idea what your tank's doing. Like I'm just gonna be real. Your tank will do some crazy shit. Like there's nothing you can do about it. Your tank will route weird, your tank will chain weird. It's a lot easier to say, oh, Without a Trace, giving one additional charge, I can use it for this specific pack. You can say that really easily if you're doing like plus 20s and you have an established group and you run the same route every time and you know your tank, right? That makes it a lot easier. And in that case, Without a Trace is better, but it's still a 4-point investment for nothing, right? If you're pugging, however, you're casting Vanish on cooldown pretty much, and I've looked through logs, and they're basically casting Vanish on cooldown. You're at most getting 2 additional charges of Vanish throughout an entire dungeon. In some really low keys, I've seen people get 3, but that's mostly skill issue. But you should expect 1 to 2 additional Vanishes across an entire dungeon, which is not great. It's not a lot of value, I'm going to be honest. The other thing here is a lot of people hate Echoing Reprimand. I have good news. Don't take it. Like, use Cold Blood instead. Cold Blood is just a macro. If you just macro it to Mutilate and Fan of Knives, you're good to go. That's all you need to do. No button required. Just macro it to your generators and call it a day. So that's currently where we're at. Is there anything else that I need to mention? Oh, we keep buffing Crimson Tempest. So there's a bunch of builds here. For example, this is a very single target heavy build. Normally you'd take Amp Poison. They keep buffing Crimson Tempest, however. I've always been of the opinion that taking Fatal Concoction Amp instead of Crimson Tempest Throne Precision is really troll. I understand why some really, really high ranking assassination rogues do it, but I don't agree. And so if they keep buffing Crimson Tempest, I think this just is not viable anymore. I mean, Crimson Tempest over the last couple of weeks alone has gotten 20% of a buff. It got 10% and they got 8% on top of that. They're obviously multiplicative, so that's pretty much a 20% buff to Crimson Tempest. If a 20% buff to Crimson Tempest isn't enough to convince you that these two talents aren't worth it, then I don't know. Like, Crimson Tempest is now doing anywhere from like 11 to 15% of your damage in a key overall. It is cranking really hard. And that also kind of is a bit of a problem for Deathstalker, because Deathstalker really wants to Envenom and really wants to Caustic Spatter. If I remind you again, Envenom is 24% of the damage here. It's really high. It's not even close to that. Like, this is 18, this is 24. It's a big difference. Deathstalker is heavy on the Envenom damage. So a single target build like this that takes Amp Poison, I can see it working. But I still think it's really, really sketch, and I think Crimson Tempest is just way too strong to not take. But I'm gonna call it there. That's enough yapping for me. Went over some buffs, went over some ideas theory crafting wise. I need to cook in The Sims, not IRL. But I need to figure out some stuff. Like, there's the changes from last week and compounding on top of the changes from this week means that there's a lot of stuff to double check. There's still a lot of bugs to double check that hopefully get fixed. Vicious Venoms is a big question mark for something that could happen. Obviously, the Deathstalker Fan of Knives talent in single target is something that could happen. There's a lot of things that need to be checked. Sanguine Blades now has more uptime because of Vicious Venoms getting buffed. Or Venomous Wounds, sorry, not Vicious Venoms, Venomous Wounds getting buffed to 8. So now there's more Sanguine Blades uptime. Maybe that changes some pooling conditions. A lot of stuff to check. I will keep you all updated. If there's big changes, I'll, of course, record another video. Otherwise, a bit of a ramble, but is what it is. Have a good one. Bye ya.